Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you're here. It's good to be with you. If you would, please turn your Bibles open to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, that is where we're going to be this morning. I want you to imagine that you're struggling in your faith. You're struggling with your walk with God. And maybe for some of you, that's not hard. Maybe that's genuinely where you're at. But if it's not, I want you to imagine that's where you are. That there's a temptation with you to walk away completely. Because the Hebrews audience, what the Hebrews are going through right now is heavy trial and persecution. And their temptation is to walk back into their former ways of being, into Judaism. Back to going to the old ways because everyone around them seems to hate them. Everyone around them is taking from them and hurting them. And what the book of Hebrews does is it talks to that audience, the audience that wants to walk away. And the first thing it does in the first 10 chapters is it tells how Jesus is greater. You're going to walk away, but I'm telling you, Jesus is greater than the things you're trying to go and walk back to. Jesus is greater than Moses. He's greater than the angels. He's greater than the priests. He's greater than their sacrifices. And then you get to chapter 11, to the rest of the book. And it's a time that calls for endurance. And it's chapters that are sown with encouragement. And what chapter 11 does is it gives a series of events and a series of people from the Old Testament and from what these people would identify as their own. And it says, I want you to examine their lives. And I want you to see how God has actually been working through the lives of everyone through your history. And how this can be an encouragement to you where you're at, because where your circumstances are and how you're feeling is not necessarily that different than the circumstances of the people within this chapter and throughout your history. And so we're going to look at faith. We're going to look at faith in the people of faith. And more importantly, we're going to look at a faithful God and how He's been working throughout time and throughout history and throughout His people. The first question is, what exactly is faith? And I think it's partly answered in verse 1, and we're going to start there. Look at verse 1. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That's the ESV. And then here on the board is, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And that's the New King James. I think somewhere in the middle of these things is the answer. What is faith? And the question, I think, begins in verse 6. Look at verse 6. And without faith, it is impossible to please Him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him. So the first thing that faith does is it starts out with a belief. A belief that God exists, that there is this spiritual realm and reality behind what we can perceive. What we necessarily experience on a day-to-day basis. That is very real and very present and very active. And God is a part of that. And alongside God are His promises. And so faith begins with this belief. And it continues onward. This belief produces an inward conviction, but also outward expressions that are rooted in the unfulfilled promises of God. Faith is both an internal thing, but it's also something that you do. It's a perspective that you have on the world around you because you believe in a reality that isn't necessarily perceived. But it is also things that you do based off of that belief and that conviction itself. That faith is something that is active and something that has action behind it. And specifically throughout the whole chapter of Hebrews 11, faith is something that is closely tied with the promises of God. If I believe in a reality that I can't perceive, part of that belief is that God exists, but part of that belief is that God promises His people certain things. And so God is promising His people certain things, and He's talking to His people. And faith, what it does is it brings substance or a reality to the things hoped for, those promises which currently do not have substance. And so what faith is doing is it's getting a promise from God and it's acting upon it and bringing the substance of that promise into the reality. And what this does is it provides evidence of the things that are unseen. It provides evidence to a God that is unseen. It provides evidence to the workings of Him that are yet to be fulfilled. And so let's break this down of what exactly looks like. Because that definition, I think it's hard to mentally work through. Trust me, hours this week spending trying to work through. But I think in the orange gets you an underlying. If you just want a basic definition of what faith is, and you don't really want to think about it too philosophically or too psychologically, just think of the second line. The belief produces an inward conviction and outward expressions. It's something both within you and that goes outside of you. And that's what you see through the rest of this chapter. So these promises, these promises that are rooted and develop in the unseen, that God gives to his people, what's interesting is they have categories throughout this text. And it's something that I didn't see until I wrote them all out and I tried to categorize them. And the first one is the resurrection of the dead. The second one is the judgment of the wicked, and the third one is the heavenly city. And what you see is that there's specific promises within these categories that the people of God are given and root themselves into. And these are the things that they believe within their hearts, but also act upon within their lives. That's their faith. These promises have categories that are also promises within themselves. These are promises that we'll see at the end of this text are actually still active and very present today. And so let's start off with the resurrection of the dead, and maybe you'll see what I'm saying. The first example of a resurrection that we see within this chapter is in verses 5 and 6, and it's with a guy named Enoch. Verses 5 and 6 say this: "By faith Enoch was taken up, that he should not see death, and he was not found, because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased to God. And without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, and he rewards those who seek him." So what's the promise that Enoch believes in that isn't seen? That God exists, and he rewards those who seek him. That's the promise. And Enoch, he has a conviction about this, but he also does something. He has an outward expression of this belief, where he seeks out God. And back in Genesis chapter 5, where Enoch is mentioned, it says he walks with God. I want you to understand something about Enoch. And you might be like, okay, I saw that guy once. Maybe he got brought up in a class, but he's not like a huge character of the Bible. Maybe if you're really into Scripture, you grew up being in the pew, this is someone that you're aware of. But for a lot of people, no idea who Enoch is. In the time of Enoch, what has happened is sin has entered into the world. Sin has come into the world, and it's brought something alongside of it. It's brought death. It's brought separation from God. And what chapter 5 of Genesis does is it goes through a pattern, and it says, this guy, he lived this many years, and then he died. And then it does that 6 more times. He died, he died, he died, he died. And then you get to Enoch, who walks with God, and he's taken. And he does not experience death. And I think oftentimes when we think of this idea of resurrection, what we think of in our mind is coming out of the ground. And I think that is very true. But what resurrection is at its core and at its baseline is going from death into life. And the world in which Enoch lived in was a world of complete death. And what God did in his life was he brought him into a place of life. He took him and he did not experience death. Now I want you to imagine like you have someone in the crowd here, who goes up to you and they're like, I'm not going to die. And they're not talking in a spiritual way of, one day Jesus is going to resurrect me, in which our faith is founded in. But they're just like, I'm not going to die, period. Actually, what God's going to do is he's going to come into my life and he's just going to take me up. You'd be like, what's going on with that guy? I don't know what's happening. Enoch is someone who lives out with that type of faith. I don't know what's going to happen, actually. I don't know the details that God's going to come and he's going to take me up. I don't know that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to act on this promise that God has given me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to act because God says that he exists and rewards those who seek him. And so I'm going to walk with him and I'm going to seek him with all I have. And then you see this resurrection. Next is look at verses 11 and 12. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as innumerable as grains of sand by the seashore. Okay, again, not traditional resurrection, what we think of. But I want you to imagine what is the situation that is occurring. You have Sarah, whose womb is barren. It is unable to conceive child. It is dead. If you want to, I think, accurately describe it, it is a dead womb. And then you have a man who's 99 at the time, who the text says is as good as dead. And so you have a dead womb and a basically dead man. And what God does with that is he brings life. And not only does he bring life, but he brings an entire nation, and more than just one nation, he brings what is described as the sands of the seashore and the stars of the heaven. And all of this is not because Sarah can necessarily see God, that Sarah knows exactly what's going to happen, but what she does is she considers the things that God has done. The things that God has done in her life thus far, and she considers him faithful. And from that consideration and from that place of faith, God acts, and God brings life from these two dead places. And so God again brings about resurrection imagery and brings life to Sarah's womb. I think the most obvious and the one that is probably most clear is what happens in verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and who had received the promise was an act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. You guys remember this story? You guys remember in Genesis 22, where Abraham takes his son that he spent his entire, past 25 years longing for and hoping for, and every ounce of emotion was within him. And he takes that son, who, by the way, the Bible, the first time the word love is ever used, is used to describe how Abraham feels about Isaac, the son whom he loves. And because God has said, you need to go and sacrifice your son, he takes him up on the mountain. And it says within Genesis 22 that he rose early in the morning. The text in Hebrews here says that in Abraham's mind, he killed Isaac that day. It was so made up in his mind that this is what I'm going to do, that it's like it just happened. But what Genesis 22 says is that the reason that Abraham came to that place and came to that conclusion was because he saw the promise of God within his life, that the offspring will be through this son and through Isaac. And because of that promise, he was willing to offer up his son, not knowing the outcome or not knowing what was to come. See, this is something I think we forget about sometimes, is that people in the Bible, we're so used to the whole part of this story, we're so used to the entirety of the story itself, that we forget that they didn't see the entirety of the story. What these people saw was a promise, and then they acted upon a promise, and then there was a fulfillment that came later within their life. This was the pattern that they experienced. And this goes on, and we see this in the judgment of the wicked. We see this with the flood. It describes how Noah, he lived in this wicked world that had wickedness all over it. And it was a place where God had regretted that he had made man because of how much evil was on the world. And what Noah does, based on the promise of he will be delivered, is he builds an ark. And I want you to imagine being like Noah. You get like 5 guys in this room. And you're like, okay, we're going to go build a box. It's not even a boat. There's not a rudder to it. There's not a sail to it. We're building a box. And we're going to build a box in a place and a time where we don't even know rain exists because it mists out of the ground. It says that in Genesis 2. There was mist that came from the ground. And there probably was not rain in Noah's time. I almost said Jonah. Noah's time. And so Noah is believing in the promise of God that there will be a flood, there will be judgment, and there will be deliverance. And so he builds this ark, and his family's saved. And this continues on, and you see this with the Exodus. I do want to read this. Look at verse 27. Verse 27, by faith he, being Moses, left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover, sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. And so what this does is it says, hey, I want you to remember Moses, and I want you to remember his life, and I want you to remember how he believed that God would deliver the people from Egypt, because this is something that God said to him. And so what he does is he goes and he holds this meal where they paint blood all over the doors, and that's what they do, and they go and they cross the Red Sea. I think sometimes we don't think about the faith that would be involved in crossing the Red Sea. If you've seen The Prince of Egypt, say like animated movie, they have this like Red Sea scene. It lasts 4 minutes, and it took 2 years to animate. 2 years to animate, just like the power of just a taste of what God did within that moment. And I want you to imagine there's just walls of water on either side of you. And what you're doing in that moment is you're saying, God said he's going to deliver us. And so he's going to hold up these walls of water that could crush me and kill me if he just decided. And that's exactly what he does with the Egyptians. He lets the Israelites pass through, and the Egyptians, they die. There's a judgment there. And then you see the judgment of the falling walls. You see this with Jericho. You have Rahab, she took in these spies, and then she, because took in the spies, was spared. And she said, you're going to be spared if you just let down this scarlet robe or cord. She lets down the scarlet cord, and everything else around her gets destroyed. If you really just like picture these stories within your mind, they kind of sound ridiculous. Like you have someone who's told this thing, and they do this very interesting action dependent on what they've been told that makes them seem like an outcast and a stranger. And this is what happens over and over and over again. We saw it with the resurrection, we saw it with the judgment, and now we see it with the heavenly city. I want to read this. Look at verses 8 through 10 of chapter 11. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Okay, skip down to verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged them that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone, they would have the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, for that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Okay, you have Abraham, who's 75 years old, and he lives in the land of Ur. He lives in a place where it seems like, based off of archaeology, there you go, archaeology, that there is sewage systems going in these places. And so he has running water, and what he does is he says, I'm going to go live in a tent. And I'm going to go live in a tent because God has given me a promise that I will have an inheritance. I will have an inheritance of this land. And what this text describes is he sees that promise not as the land of Israel necessarily, but more so as a land that is to come, that God is building out. There's a city whose designer and builder is God. There's a heavenly city that God is building and that he has gone to prepare. And Jesus describes the city, and he talks about the city, how there's a city of God that is being prepared for his people, and Revelation shows this city, and it shows this city being lived out. And this is what Abraham was believing in, and this is what Abraham was going out and doing and living out. He said, God has given me a promise. I believe in that promise and act upon that promise. And then God, even though I didn't see it within the moment of my action, is going to fulfill that promise. This is the pattern you see over again. All right, one more and then we'll be done. Not with the lesson, just with this. So, forsaking Egypt, look at verse 23 through 26. You have a guy named Moses. And by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he'd grown up, refused to be called the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Okay, Moses grew up in the house of Pharaoh. That's where he lived. And this was normal life to him. He probably had every luxury. This is like being Jeff Bezos' grandson. That is what Moses is experiencing. And what Moses does is he leaves that because he says, what God is giving me in the future reward, and what I see beyond what is right now is so great that I'm willing to give up all those things. I'm willing to give up prestige. I'm willing to give up wealth. I'm willing to give up whatever it takes in order to have that. And it's not seen, but it is acted upon. And that is what faith is. Not seeing, but acting upon with a conviction, but not only a conviction, but a participation within that promise. See, faith does something interesting. And this is the struggle of it. Faith isn't something that always has the same result. It does in some senses, and it doesn't in other senses. So what we've seen throughout the pattern of all these stories, and I appreciate you for enduring that with me, it is difficult to understand how to communicate that. You see these promises over and over again, and you see the fulfillment, and you see them and the people of faith acting in between. And what is always consistent within someone's faith is the end result. God's always faithful. God is always faithful within each of these. There's always a fulfillment line that happens. But sometimes you have things that are very mighty. And you have these things that are occurring that are quite amazing. And that's what is described in verses 32 through 34. And what more shall I say? For time would fail to tell of Gideon and Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign powers to flight. Sometimes the result of faith and what happens is these mighty and wonderful experiences and deeds. And I think when it's times of faith like that, we hold on to them. And then we see them within our own lives. And we're comforted by them because it's so obvious. I mean, imagine being Daniel in the lion's den. And then the mouth of the lion's shut. And you're like, I'm right. Like God is with me. This is so clear. This is so obvious. Imagine being any of these people and any of these men. Imagine being David and God delivering you over and over again when you're in the wilderness. There's times where faith is so obvious and it gives us what we want. And so it slaps us in the face and we're satisfied. But there's also where there's times when that's not the case whatsoever. And you have these times where there's this promise, and then there's this hardship, and there's this act of faith, but it's not necessarily the result we thought it would be. And that's when it becomes difficult. And that's what the Hebrews are going through. It's easy when it's all these stories of these great things. It's a lot more difficult when it's the stories of these next things. Look at verses 35 through 38. Women received back their dead from the resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise even to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goats and destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in the deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. If anyone's lived a life of faith long enough, they know it's not always sunshines and rainbows. They know sometimes that the walk of faith and following God and a pursuit of righteousness and having your whole heart towards Him sometimes comes with difficulties and hardships. And sometimes people mistreat you. And these people are actively going through these problems. When they hear stories of people being killed and tortured and mocked and stoned and sawed in two and even having to be homeless on account of their faith in God, it makes sense to the Hebrew people. And I think when we're going through our lives and when we're facing the struggles of our lives, sometimes it's going to be, oh, there's mighty deeds and there's mighty things and it's working out how I thought it should and how I thought it would. And there's going to be times where we face hardship and it doesn't go the way that we thought. There's going to be times when we're walking alongside of God and the thing that we want to do is walk away. Where we are like the Hebrew audience here, where people who have grown up hearing these stories and we know them. And the fact that I could even talk about those stories and you could know exactly what I'm talking about, even if it wasn't explained well, you could even think about the chapters they were in, tells you you're kind of in the same ballpark of where these people are. And they want to walk away and they want to give up. Because life has gotten too much and it's become difficult and it's become trialsome. And the story of faith here sometimes is called the Hall of Faith, but it's really not about a faithful people, it's about a faithful God. It's about how God has come into the picture every single time, and ultimately how this chapter ends is pointing towards Jesus. And what the Hebrews writer is trying to do is it's trying to point this audience towards Jesus, and it says this in verse 39, and all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God has provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. See, faith, what it understands is what Jesus has accomplished. It is the way of ultimate fulfillment of what God has promised is Jesus Christ himself. And all of the past fulfillments were just shadows. I want to show you this. This is actually pretty cool. So you have these three categories. There you go. And then you have the specific promises. Every promise that we went through today, and all those stories that we said, Jesus ultimately fulfills those specific promises in himself. We have all of these same promises, but we have a greater fulfillment of them. And that's what the Hebrews writer is trying to point us towards, is when you're thinking about giving up and stepping away, see how the Lord has worked throughout the history of his people, and you can literally go story by story, or you can think about just the work of Jesus himself and what he's accomplished, and how he has ultimately done these things to such a greater level that everything else is like a shadow. And when you see the faithfulness of God, hold on, because it's the same God who is faithful. And so when you look at the categories of resurrection, if you look at the categories of judgment and the heavenly city, what you say is God is still promising those things. That you want to walk away right now. And I understand, because the way that your life is going and because the struggles that are surrounding your faith right now, it is difficult. But these are the promises that are still unfulfilled to their fullest. And God will fulfill them how he has fulfilled every other promise before. You have a passage like this that says, and he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. In Revelation it says this, I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. These are our promises. These are things that in our mind should be sure, but they're unseen. They're unseen, but what we do when we act in faith is we live them out as they will be real, and as if they are real, because they are. These promises are so sure that they are real themselves. And what is evidence of that is the working and the power and the story of the people of God, but how he has fulfilled in each of them these promises before. This is nothing new. Right now, we're just in the middle part. God has given us this promise. There will be a fulfillment, but right now we're in the middle. And the question is, will you be someone of faith? Will you be someone who believes in these promises so surely and so real that you act upon them and that your life is transformed? But not only is your life transformed and you act upon them, but that you hold on and you endure. When things are terrible and when things are rough, when you're persecuted, when you're made fun of, when you're isolated, whatever it might be, even if it gets to an extreme, when you have to give up everything else in order to hold on to God, will you? If you understand and you believe that these promises are true and sure, if you've meditated on the faithfulness of God, you'll hold on. I appreciate you guys listening this morning. I appreciate you guys taking the time to be here. This is a beautiful chapter of the Bible. It's a chapter that has so many stories within it, so many things where it's just trying to call to mind these memories that of time you have heard these scriptures, of time that you've spent in these scriptures. And ultimately what it's trying to do is it's trying to say, hold on when it's hard to hold on. Because your God is the same God that has always been and is faithful like He's always been. And maybe you're here and you don't know that God. Maybe you're here and you don't know those stories whatsoever. That could be really accurate and that could be really real. We'd love to talk to you about those stories, but more importantly, we'd love to talk to you about that God who's working in those stories. How that God can come into your life. And how that God is faithful and true just like He was then and just like He always will be. Whatever your need, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.